At a celebration dinner held specifically to toast her son's freedom from his burdensome marriage, Linda Simon raised her wineglass and delivered a final, cutting toast to the absent ex-daughter-in-law. The family erupted in laughter, clinking glasses over shared jokes about the woman they'd spent years dismissing as plain, poor, and utterly beneath them. What none of them realized as they sipped wine purchased with paychecks from Valencia Holdings was that the quiet woman they just mocked owned the company. Every dollar they'd bragged about, every promotion they'd celebrated, every executive perk they'd flaunted came from her empire. And she was standing at their front door, about to deliver more than just divorce papers. Her calm voice and a single phone call would dismantle everything they thought they'd built. Welcome to Stories by Jason. If you're settled in and ready for a good story, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I've got another exciting story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Now, let's dive in. The Simon family home on Oak Ridge Drive had always been loud on Sunday evenings. Voices competed over roasted chicken and red wine, each family member trying to outdo the others with stories of workplace victories, corporate ladder climbs, and professional recognition. Tonight was louder than usual because tonight was a celebration. To Andrew's fresh start. Thomas Simon bellowed from the head of the table, his booming voice filled with paternal pride. At 62, he carried himself like a man who'd earned every gray hair through decades of corporate dedication. His title, Senior Operations Manager at Valencia Holdings, sat on his shoulders like a crown. To freedom, Linda added, her sharp features arranged in a satisfied smile. She'd never liked Mitchell, her former daughter-in-law, and made no effort to hide her relief that the marriage was finally over. Andrew, darling, you did the right thing. That girl was holding you back. Clara, Andrew's younger sister, giggled into her wineglass. At 28, she worked in Valencia Holdings' administrative department and treated the family dinner table like an extension of office gossip sessions. I still can't believe she thought she belonged in this family. Did you see the car she drove? It was practically held together with duct tape. And those clothes, Linda continued, her voice dripping with disdain. Always so plain. No style, no ambition, no substance. I tried to help her, you know. Suggested professional development courses, networking events. She just smiled and nodded like she had no idea how the real world worked. Andrew sat quietly at his usual spot, pushing food around his plate. At 34, he should have felt relieved. He'd made the choice to divorce Mitchell himself, after all. He'd been the one to say he couldn't live in her shadow anymore, couldn't bear feeling like less than a man in his own marriage. But something about his family's celebration felt hollow, like laughing at a joke whose punchline hadn't fully landed yet. Valencia Holdings doesn't tolerate mediocrity, Thomas declared, launching into one of his familiar speeches. That's why we've all thrived there. Excellence recognizes excellence. It's in our blood, this drive for success. Mitchell never understood that kind of ambition. The irony was so thick it could have choked them all if any of them had possessed the awareness to taste it. For 5 years, Mitchell had sat at this very table, enduring these very conversations. She'd listened to Thomas pontificate about corporate strategy for a company she'd founded at 19. She'd smiled politely while Linda critiqued her wardrobe choices, never mentioning that she could have bought Linda's entire closet without checking her bank balance. She'd nodded along as Clara explained basic business concepts that Mitchell had written case studies about at Harvard. She'd done it all because she'd loved Andrew. Because she genuinely believed that love meant sacrifice, meant making yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. Because she'd wanted so desperately to belong to a family after growing up without one that she'd been willing to be invisible. The Simons had never suspected. Why would they? Mitchell drove a 12-year-old sedan. She shopped at outlet malls. She lived in a modest apartment and never wore jewelry that cost more than $20. She'd played the role of the humble, struggling young woman so convincingly that the family had never thought to question the narrative they'd constructed about her. Valencia Holdings had been carefully built to keep Mitchell's identity obscured. The public face of the company was a board of directors and a CEO she'd hired specifically to deflect attention. Her name appeared on exactly 3 documents buried so deep in corporate filing systems that even most employees didn't know she existed. Only Andrew had known the truth, and she'd sworn him to secrecy because he'd begged her to. "Please," he'd said early in their relationship, his face tight with barely concealed insecurity. "I need to be my own man. People know you're what you are. I'll always just be your husband. Just let me have this." So she had. She'd given him dignity at the cost of her own. She'd pretended to struggle financially while secretly paying off his student loans, his credit card debt, his car payment. She'd let his family mock her professional prospects while signing their paychecks. She'd endured Linda's questions about her lack of family and unstable background, without ever mentioning that she'd built a multi-billion-dollar empire from a foster home bedroom. Love, she'd thought, required patience, required grace, required endurance. She'd been wrong. Now, 1 month after Andrew had served her divorce papers because he needed to find himself and couldn't be married to someone who made him feel inadequate, the Simon family sat in their company-provided executive home, drinking wine purchased with bonuses from her company, celebrating their liberation from her presence. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:30. Linda frowned. "Are we expecting someone?" Andrew's face went pale. He recognized something in the timing, the precision of it. Mitchell had always been precise. "I'll get it," he said quickly, standing so fast his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. But Clara was already at the door, swinging it open with the careless confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequence. Mitchell stood on the doorstep in jeans and a plain white blouse, a manila envelope tucked under one arm. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore no makeup. She looked, as always, unremarkable to people who measured worth in appearances. "Oh," Clara said flatly, her smile curdling. "It's you." "Hello, Clara." Mitchell's voice was soft, controlled. "I need to speak with Andrew. I have the final divorce documents." "You couldn't have mailed them?" Clara made no move to let her inside. "I wanted to return something in person." Mitchell held up a small velvet box. "The Simon family ring. It belongs with you, not with me." Linda appeared in the hallway, her expression hardening the moment she saw who stood at the door. "Mitchell. How unexpected." "I'll only be a moment," Mitchell said evenly. "Then I'll be out of your lives permanently." "Finally," Linda muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Come in then. Let's get this over with." Mitchell stepped inside, her movements calm and deliberate. She'd been in this house countless times, had cooked in that kitchen, had tried to make conversation in that living room, had smiled through dozens of dinners where every word felt like a small cut. This would be the last time. Thomas looked up from the dinner table as Mitchell entered, his expression shifting from surprise to poorly concealed disdain. "Mitchell, I'd say this is a pleasant surprise, but we're in the middle of a family dinner." "I understand." Mitchell placed the envelope on the table next to his wineglass. "These are the signed documents. Everything is finalized." She set the ring box beside it. "And this is yours." Andrew stood frozen near his chair, unable to meet her eyes. Clara leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Must be hard, giving up the best thing that ever happened to you." Mitchell turned to look at her, really look at her, for perhaps the first time without love blurring her vision. "You have no idea what I'm giving up," she said quietly. "Or what I'm reclaiming." Linda laughed, sharp and brittle. "Reclaiming? Dear, you came into this marriage with nothing and you're leaving with nothing. At least have the dignity not to be dramatic about it." Something shifted in Mitchell's expression. Years of patience crystallized into something harder, clearer. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "Actually," she said, her voice still soft but carrying a new weight, "there's something you should know before I leave." Thomas frowned. "What are you talking about?" Mitchell looked at each of them in turn. The family that had spent 5 years making her feel small. The people who had measured her worth and found her wanting. The faces that had never once looked at her with genuine kindness or respect. "Valencia Holdings," she said simply. "The company you're all so proud to work for. The corporation that provides your salaries, your benefits, your executive housing." She paused, letting the word settle. "I own it." The silence that fell over the room was absolute. "I'm not just Mitchell Simon," she continued, her voice steady as stone. "I'm Mitchell Valencia, founder and CEO. Every paycheck you've ever celebrated came from a company I built." Linda's wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor. 15 years earlier, Mitchell Valencia had learned early that the world didn't owe her anything. At 6 years old, when her mother disappeared without explanation and social services found her alone in a one-bedroom apartment surviving on cereal and tap water, she'd understood that survival required self-reliance. The foster care system had been neither cruel nor kind. It had simply been indifferent, a series of temporary homes where she was always the outsider, always the one who didn't quite belong. By 16, she'd stopped waiting for someone to save her and started saving herself. It began with a laptop donated to her foster home and an internet connection she taught herself to optimize. Mitchell had always been good with patterns, with seeing systems where others saw chaos. She noticed inefficiencies in how small businesses managed their inventory, how local suppliers struggled with logistics coordination, how communication breakdowns cost companies thousands in wasted time and resources. So she built a solution. A simple platform at first, just a web-based tool that connected small retailers with suppliers, streamlining the ordering process. She coded it herself, teaching herself programming through YouTube videos and library books, working late into the night while her foster siblings slept. The platform worked. Within 6 months, she had 30 businesses using it. Within a year, 300. By the time she aged out of foster care at 18, she had venture capital firms knocking on her door and a company valuation that made her financial advisor suggest she sit down before hearing the number. She called it Valencia Holdings, taking back the surname her mother had abandoned her with and turning it into something that meant power instead of pain. By 25, Valencia Holdings had expanded into tech logistics on a massive scale, serving Fortune 500 companies and international corporations. Mitchell had become a billionaire, though most people didn't know it. She deliberately structured the company to keep herself out of the spotlight, installing a public-facing CEO and board of directors while she operated from behind the scenes. She'd built an empire, but empires felt cold when you lived in them alone. Money had given Mitchell security, power, independence, everything except the one thing she'd wanted since childhood. A family. A place to belong. Someone who chose her not for what she could provide, but simply for who she was. That's what she'd thought she'd found in Andrew Simon. 7 years earlier, she'd met him at a charity gala she'd attended incognito, dressed simply while others wore designer gowns worth more than cars. Andrew had been charming, self-deprecating, funny in a way that felt genuine. He worked as a project analyst for a mid-sized firm, spoke passionately about his career aspirations, and treated her like she mattered without knowing she had money. It had felt like freedom. They'd dated for 6 months before Mitchell told him the truth. She'd been terrified, certain that the revelation would change everything. And it had, just not in the way she'd expected. Andrew had been shocked, then impressed, then diminished. She'd watched it happen in real time, the way his posture changed, the way his smile became tighter. The way he started comparing himself to her in every conversation, measuring his accomplishments against hers and finding himself wanting. "I need you to understand something," he'd said one night, his voice strained with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I need to be my own man. I can't have everyone knowing that my girlfriend is what you are. I'll always just be Mitchell Valencia's boyfriend. I'll never be Andrew Simon, successful professional. I'll just be the guy who got lucky." She should have seen the warning signs then. Should have recognized that a love requiring her to diminish herself wasn't really love at all. But she'd been so hungry for belonging, so desperate to finally have someone choose her, that she'd agreed to his terms. She'd hidden her wealth, simplified her lifestyle, and when he'd proposed a year later, she'd said yes without hesitation. She'd even agreed when he'd asked her to take his name instead of keeping Valencia. She'd become Mitchell Simon, and in doing so, had locked away the most powerful parts of herself. The wedding had been small. Andrew's family had attended with forced smiles and thinly veiled skepticism. Linda had asked intrusive questions about Mitchell's background, making pointed comments about family breeding and proper upbringing. Thomas had grilled her about her career prospects with the condescending patience of a man who believed he knew better. Clara had simply ignored her, treating Mitchell like temporary furniture that would eventually be removed. Mitchell had endured it all because Andrew had asked her to. Because she believed that sacrifice was the same as love. Because she'd convinced herself that being chosen, even conditionally, was better than being alone. For 5 years, she'd played the role of the struggling young wife. She'd taken a modest job at a nonprofit to maintain appearances. She'd driven an old car and shopped at thrift stores and pretended that every dollar mattered. She'd sat at the Simon family dinner table and listened to them mock the very qualities she'd actually possessed: ambition, intelligence, business acumen, while pretending she didn't. And when Andrew's credit card debt had spiraled, when his car had needed replacing, when his career had stalled and he'd needed connections to get promoted, Mitchell had quietly, invisibly solved every problem. She'd paid off his debts through anonymous loan forgiveness programs. She'd arranged for his car to be won in a raffle she'd funded. She'd ensured his name appeared on the shortlist for a position at Valencia Holdings, where he'd been hired based on manufactured merit. She'd given him everything while appearing to have nothing. She'd loved him enough to erase herself. Until the day he'd decided even her diminished presence was too much to bear. The first time Mitchell met the Simon family, she'd been nervous in a way that business negotiations had never made her feel. She'd faced venture capitalists, corporate executives, and hostile board members without flinching, but the prospect of meeting Andrew's parents had left her hands trembling as she'd stood on their doorstep clutching a homemade apple pie. "They're going to love you," Andrew had assured her, squeezing her hand. "Just be yourself." But yourself had been the problem from the very first moment. Linda Simon had opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her gaze sweeping over Mitchell's simple dress and modest jewelry with barely concealed assessment. "So you're the girl Andrew's been so secretive about," she'd said, the word "girl" somehow managing to sound diminishing. "Come in, dear. Let's have a look at you." The dinner had been an interrogation disguised as polite conversation. "So, Mitchell," Linda had begun, her tone deceptively light as she passed the breadbasket. "Tell us about your family. Where are your people from?" Mitchell had felt Andrew stiffen beside her. They'd discussed this, prepared for it, but actually saying the words out loud felt like exposing a wound. "I grew up in foster care," she'd said quietly. "I don't have much information about my biological family." The silence that followed had been deafening. Thomas had cleared his throat uncomfortably. Clara had stared with unconcealed curiosity. And Linda had pressed her lips together in a way that suggested she'd just confirmed something unpleasant. "Oh," Linda had finally said, her voice dripping with performative sympathy. "How difficult for you." "Well, family is so important, isn't it? The foundation of everything. I always say you can tell everything about a person by looking at where they come from." The implication had been clear. Mitchell came from nowhere, therefore she was no one. Thomas had picked up where his wife left off, pivoting to safer territory, or so he'd thought. "What do you do for work, Mitchell?" "I work in tech logistics," she'd answered carefully, using the vague phrasing she and Andrew had agreed upon. "Supply chain management, systems optimization." "Tech logistics," Thomas had repeated, nodding sagely. "Entry level, I assume? Customer service? Data entry?" "I do a bit of everything," Mitchell had said, which was technically true. She did everything from strategic planning to final approval on major acquisitions. "Well, you've certainly found the right boyfriend to learn from," Thomas had continued, completely missing Andrew's subtle headshake. "Andrew's doing excellent work at Whitmore and Associates. Real corporate strategy, high-level thinking. If you're interested in actually moving up in the business world, I'm sure he'd be happy to explain how things really work. Corporate etiquette, professional networking, these things matter tremendously if you want to be taken seriously." Mitchell had wanted to laugh. She'd wanted to tell Thomas that she'd lectured on corporate strategy at Harvard Business School, that she'd been invited to speak at the World Economic Forum, that his understanding of high-level thinking wouldn't fill a footnote in her quarterly reports. Instead, she'd smiled and said, "I'd appreciate any advice." Andrew had squeezed her knee under the table, gratitude or warning, She'd never been sure which. Clara had been the cruelest in her casualness, her insults delivered with the careless ease of someone who didn't even consider them worth effort. "That's a cute dress," she'd said, the word cute somehow conveying exactly how unsophisticated she found it. "Where did you get it? Target? Walmart?" "A thrift store, actually," Mitchell had answered honestly. She'd always preferred shopping secondhand, finding treasure in places others overlooked. Clara had laughed, bright and dismissive. "How economical. Andrew, you didn't tell us your girlfriend was so budget-conscious." The evening had continued in the same vein. 1,000 small cuts, each one individually dismissible but collectively devastating. Linda had questioned her education, her career prospects, her understanding of proper society. Thomas had mansplained concepts Mitchell had mastered years ago, speaking slowly as if she couldn't grasp complex ideas. Clara had made joke after joke about Mitchell's appearance, her car, her apparent lack of ambition. And Andrew had said nothing. He'd sat beside her, occasionally offering a weak smile or a reassuring touch, but never once defending her. Never once stopping his family's casual cruelty. He'd simply let it happen, as if Mitchell's humiliation was a necessary price to pay for his family's acceptance. On the drive home, Mitchell had been quiet, processing the evening's wounds. "They'll warm up to you," Andrew had said, his voice strained with forced optimism. "They're just protective. Once they get to know you better." "Andrew," she'd interrupted gently, "your mother basically said I come from bad stock. Your father treated me like I'm intellectually inferior. Your sister mocked everything about me." "They didn't mean it like that," he'd insisted, though his tone suggested even he didn't believe it. "It's just, they have high standards. They're successful people who value success. Once you've established yourself more professionally, once you've proven yourself." "Proven myself," Mitchell had repeated quietly. She'd already proven herself. She'd built an empire. She'd accumulated more success than the entire Simon family combined. But she couldn't say that because Andrew had asked her not to. Because revealing her identity would make him feel small. So she'd absorbed the insults and said nothing. It had become a pattern. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual drop-by visit had been another exercise in endurance. Linda's questions about when Mitchell would finally make something of herself. Thomas's lectures about work ethic and professional development. Clara's mocking observations about Mitchell's clothes, her car, her apparent inability to understand the finer things in life. And always, Andrew's silence. His complicity. His willingness to let his family tear down the woman he claimed to love. What the Simons never knew was that their mockery came with a bitter irony. While Linda criticized Mitchell's lack of financial sophistication, Mitchell was quietly paying down Andrew's $40,000 in credit card debt. While Thomas lectured her about career advancement, Mitchell was arranging for Andrew's promotion to Valencia Holdings through carefully placed recommendations. While Clara laughed at Mitchell's old car, Mitchell was anonymously covering Andrew's car payment each month because his salary couldn't stretch far enough. She'd been supporting him, supporting his entire lifestyle, while his family convinced him she was a burden. And slowly, insidiously, Andrew had begun to believe them. She'd noticed it in small ways at first. The way he'd stopped defending her, even in private. The way he'd started criticizing her choices, her simple wardrobe, her modest apartment, her refusal to pursue more impressive career opportunities. The way he'd begun comparing himself to her colleagues, to her success, and finding himself lacking. "Why don't you try harder?" he'd asked one night after a particularly difficult family dinner. "If you just put in more effort, showed more ambition, maybe they'd respect you more." Mitchell had stared at him, stunned. She'd been working 18-hour days running a billion-dollar corporation while maintaining the facade of a struggling non-profit employee. She'd been juggling more responsibility before breakfast than most people handled in a month. But she couldn't tell him that. So instead, she'd apologized. Promised to try harder. Made herself smaller still. The resentment in Andrew had grown like rot in foundation, invisible until the structure began to collapse. He'd started resenting her for the very thing he'd asked her to do, hide her success. He'd resented her quiet confidence, her calm competence, The way she never seemed stressed about money despite supposedly earning very little. "It's like nothing bothers you," he'd accused once. "Like you're above it all. It makes me feel like I'm constantly struggling while you just coast through life." She'd been juggling a major corporate acquisition, managing a crisis in the European division, and negotiating a multi-billion-dollar contract. But to Andrew, she was simply coasting. The cruelty had been quiet, gradual, and utterly devastating. Not dramatic explosions but slow erosion, wearing away at Mitchell's sense of self until she'd almost forgotten who she'd been before she'd learned to apologize for existing. Almost. But not quite. The beginning of the end came on a Tuesday afternoon when Andrew opened the mail. Mitchell had been in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming quietly to herself while chopping vegetables. It was one of her rare early evenings. She'd delegated most of her pressing responsibilities to give herself time to focus on the marriage she'd felt slowly slipping through her fingers. "What the hell is this?" She'd looked up to find Andrew standing in the doorway, his face pale except for 2 spots of angry red on his cheeks. He held a letter in his trembling hand, official letterhead from Capital One Bank. Mitchell's stomach dropped. She'd been so careful, so meticulous about covering her tracks. "Andrew, this says my entire credit card debt has been paid off," he interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "All $43,000. Paid in full by an anonymous benefactor through some kind of debt relief program I never applied for." She set down the knife carefully, buying herself a moment to think. "That's wonderful news." "Don't." The word came out sharp, cutting. "Don't stand there and lie to me. Call the bank." I demanded to know who paid this off. They wouldn't tell me specifics, but the woman I spoke to let slip that it came from a private trust. A Valencia trust. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "You," Andrew said, his voice breaking. "It was you. You've been paying my debts." "How long, Mitchell? How long have you been secretly solving my problems like I'm some kind of charity case?" "It wasn't like that," Mitchell said quietly, moving toward him. "I love you. I wanted to help." "Help?" He laughed, bitter and harsh. "You wanted to help by making me feel like a complete failure? By reminding me every single day that you don't need me? That you're so far above me that my problems are just minor inconveniences you can solve with a phone call? That's not fair." "Fair." Andrew threw the letter onto the counter. "What's not fair is being married to someone who's been lying to me. Playing some kind of twisted game where you pretend to struggle while secretly having enough money to erase my debt like it's nothing." "You asked me to hide my wealth," Mitchell reminded him, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "You said you needed to be your own man. I was trying to respect that. By treating me like a child who can't handle his own responsibilities?" Andrew paced the kitchen, his movements jerky with agitation. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? My friends respect you more than they respect me. My own family thinks I'm married down, but the truth is I'm the one who doesn't measure up. I'm just some mediocre project analyst while you're whatever the hell you actually are." "I'm your wife," Mitchell said softly. "That's all I've ever wanted to be." "No." Andrew stopped pacing, turning to face her with eyes that held something worse than anger, resignation. "You're Mitchell Valencia, billionaire CEO. And I'm just Andrew Simon, the guy who was stupid enough to think he could be married to someone like you without becoming completely irrelevant." Over the following weeks, the argument had replayed itself in various forms. Each time, Andrew's resentment had grown sharper, more pointed. He'd started cataloging every way Mitchell outshone him, every moment where her competence had made his struggles seem trivial by comparison. "Your colleagues treat you like you're someone important," he'd said one night. "When we go to your work events, people actually listen when you talk. Nobody cares what the project analyst husband thinks." "We could go to counseling," Mitchell had suggested desperately. "We could work through this together." "There's nothing to work through," Andrew had shouted. "The problem isn't something that can be fixed in therapy. The problem is that I don't want to be a shadow next to my wife. I don't want to spend the rest of my life feeling like I'm your accessory, your pet project, your charity case." "So what are you saying?" Mitchell had asked, though she'd already known the answer. She'd seen it coming like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and devastating. "I want a divorce." The words had landed like physical blows, even though she'd been bracing for them. Mitchell had stood in their living room, the apartment she'd paid for but pretended to split costs on, and felt the foundation of everything she'd sacrificed crumble beneath her feet. "Andrew, please. I need to find myself," he'd continued, his voice taking on the rehearsed quality of someone who'd practiced this speech. "I need to figure out who I am when I'm not constantly being compared to you. I need a life where I can be successful on my own terms, not just riding your coattails." "I never asked you to ride my coattails," Mitchell had said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to remain calm. "I asked you to share a life with me. A life where you have all the power," Andrew had countered. "A life where you're always the one solving problems, making things happen, being the capable one. That's not a partnership, Mitchell. That's just you tolerating my inadequacy." She tried to argue. Tried to explain that she'd hidden her success because he'd asked her to, that she'd made herself smaller because he'd needed her to be. But Andrew hadn't wanted to hear it. His mind had been made up, his resentment too deeply rooted to be reasoned with. He'd moved out 3 days later. The divorce proceedings had been mercifully brief. Mitchell had offered him a generous settlement, enough to buy a nice condo, enough to feel secure, but he'd refused. "I don't want your money," he'd said coldly during their final mediation meeting. "I just want out." So she'd given him that instead. A clean break. No alimony, no contested assets, just a simple dissolution of their marriage. She'd signed the papers with steady hands and a breaking heart, watching 5 years of sacrifice and compromise reduced to legal documentation. The month that followed had been strange. Mitchell had moved through her days in a fog, going through the motions of running her empire while feeling fundamentally empty. She'd reclaimed her maiden name legally, started driving her real car, bought clothes that actually fit her position. She'd stopped pretending to struggle and started remembering what it felt like to simply exist as herself. But the grief had been persistent. Not for Andrew specifically, she'd slowly come to recognize that she'd loved an idea more than the actual man, but for the family she'd thought she'd finally found. For the belonging she'd believed was worth any price. Her executive assistant had handled most of the divorce paperwork, including the final documents that needed Andrew's signature on a few remaining items. Mitchell had planned to have them couriered over. But then she'd received a text from Clara, accidentally sent to her instead of to someone else. Thank God Andrew finally got rid of that dead weight. Family dinner tonight to celebrate his freedom. Mitchell had stared at that message for a long time. Dead weight. Celebrate his freedom. The Simon family was throwing a party to commemorate the end of her marriage. To toast their son's escape from the woman they'd spent 5 years systematically belittling. Something had shifted in her then. Some final thread of patience had simply snapped. She'd called her head of human resources. "Pull up all the Simon family employment files," she'd said quietly. "Thomas, Linda, Clara, and Andrew. I want a full review completed by tomorrow." "Is there a problem, Ms. Valencia?" her HR director had asked carefully. "Not yet," Mitchell had replied. "But there's about to be." She'd spent the next week preparing, reviewing performance records, consulting with legal, ensuring every step was airtight and justified. Not because she wanted revenge. Revenge implied anger, and what she felt was colder than that. It was simply a decision to stop absorbing cruelty. To finally, definitively choose herself. On the evening of the Simon family's celebration dinner, Mitchell had dressed in her simple jeans and white blouse one final time. She'd printed out the divorce papers, retrieved the Simon family ring from her jewelry box, and driven to Oak Ridge Drive. Not for closure. Not for revenge. Simply to deliver consequences. And now, sitting in her Tesla as she drove away from the house on Oak Ridge Drive for the last time. The Simon house glowed warmly against the evening darkness, every window lit with the kind of abundance that comes from never having to worry about electricity bills. Through the front window, Mitchell could see movement, the familiar choreography of a family dinner in full swing. Laughter drifted out into the quiet street, loud and self-satisfied. She sat in her car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting herself feel the weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't anger driving her forward. It was something cleaner, sharper. It was the simple understanding that she owed them nothing, not her silence, not her patience, and certainly not her continued protection. Mitchell picked up the manila envelope from the passenger seat and the small velvet ring box. One last courtesy. One final gesture of the respect they'd never shown her. Then she would be done. The doorbell's chime cut through the noise inside, followed by a momentary lull in conversation. Mitchell heard Clara's voice, bright with wine and satisfaction. "I'll get it. Probably a delivery or something." The door swung open, and Clara's smile curdled the instant she recognized who stood on the doorstep. "Oh!" The single syllable managed to convey layers of disdain. "It's you." Mitchell met her gaze steadily. "Hello, Clara. I need to speak with Andrew. I have the final divorce documents and something to return." Clara didn't move to let her in, instead leaning against the doorframe with studied casualness. "You couldn't have mailed them? Oh wait, I forgot. You probably can't afford the postage." She laughed at her own joke, loud enough to draw attention from inside. "Who is it?" Linda's voice called from the dining room. "Just Mitchell," Clara called back, emphasizing the just, with particular cruelty. "Come to deliver papers, apparently." "Well, let her in then," Thomas's voice boomed. "Let's not conduct business on the doorstep like common tradespeople." Clara stepped aside with exaggerated reluctance, and Mitchell entered the house for what she knew would be the last time. The familiar scent hit her immediately: roasted chicken, red wine, Linda's expensive perfume. The dining room table was set with the good china, wine glasses catching the chandelier light like small beacons of celebration. They were celebrating her pain, toasting her absence. Linda appeared in the hallway, wine glass in hand, her expression hardening the moment she saw Mitchell. "Well, this is unexpected. We're in the middle of a family dinner." "I apologize for the intrusion," Mitchell said evenly, though they all knew she'd never been considered family enough to intrude. "I only need a moment." She walked into the dining room where Thomas sat at the head of the table, Andrew frozen mid-bite at his usual seat. The remains of their celebration dinner spread before them, half-empty wine bottles, plates still full of food, Thomas's reading glasses sitting atop what looked like a Valencia Holdings quarterly report. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. Mitchell placed the manila envelope on the table beside Thomas's plate. "The final divorce documents. Everything is signed and notarized. You just need Andrew's signature on page 7. She set the velvet ring box beside it. "And this is the Simon family ring. I believe it belongs with you, not with me anymore." Finally, Linda muttered into her wine glass, just loud enough to be heard. Some sense from the girl. Thomas picked up the ring box, examining it with the satisfied air of someone reclaiming stolen property. "Yes, well, this has been in the family for 3 generations. Glad to have it back where it belongs." Where it belongs. As if Mitchell had somehow stolen it rather than received it as a symbol of love and commitment. Andrew still hadn't spoken, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, his face carefully blank in that way he'd perfected over the years of avoiding conflict. Clara circled around to block Mitchell's path back to the door, arms crossed over her chest. "You know, Mitchell, I have to say, I'm impressed you had the dignity to return that ring. Most women in your position would have held onto it out of spite." "In my position?" Mitchell repeated quietly. "You know." Clara waved her hand dismissively. "Divorced, single, aimless. No real career prospects, no family connections, no substance. You really should be grateful Andrew even married you in the first place. A woman with nothing? You got incredibly lucky." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Mitchell had heard variations of this speech for 5 years, had absorbed similar insults at every family gathering, every holiday, every casual encounter. She'd trained herself to let them slide off like water, to smile politely and excuse herself, to choose silence over confrontation. But something was different tonight. Maybe it was the celebration dinner, the casual cruelty of toasting her removal from their lives. Maybe it was the weight of the phone in her pocket and the knowledge of what one call could unleash. Maybe she was simply tired of being treated as less than human by people who wouldn't recognize real power if it signed their paychecks. Which of course it did. Lucky, Mitchell repeated, her voice still soft but carrying a new edge that made Andrew finally look up, real fear flickering in his eyes. He knew that tone. He'd heard it exactly once before, during a business call he'd accidentally overheard, when Mitchell had been firing a division head for ethics violations. Yes, Lucky, Linda chimed in, emboldened by wine and her daughter's cruelty. Let's be honest, dear. You came into this marriage with nothing and you're leaving with nothing. You were a burden from day one. The best thing Andrew ever did was recognize that and cut his losses. A burden? Deadweight? Nothing. 5 years of those words. 5 years of making herself smaller, quieter, less than she was. 5 years of absorbing their contempt while secretly ensuring their prosperity. 5 years of sacrifice for a family that had never once looked at her with kindness. Mitchell took a slow breath, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too wild. This was colder. Clear. The simple, crystalline understanding that she was done. You have no idea how lucky you all were, she said quietly. Thomas frowned, setting down his wine glass. Excuse me? Mitchell turned to face them all. Linda with her superior smirk, Thomas with his puffed-up self-importance, Clara with her casual cruelty, and Andrew with his cowardly silence. The family that had taught her that some people would always mistake kindness for weakness, that generosity would always be interpreted as desperation. Lucky, Mitchell repeated, louder now, her voice steady as stone. You have no idea how lucky you all were that I loved your son enough to hide who I really am. That I cared enough about his fragile ego to pretend to be less than I am. That I tolerated 5 years of your disrespect because I believed family was worth any price. What are you talking about? Linda demanded, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. Something in Mitchell's tone, in her posture, had changed. This wasn't the meek daughter-in-law they were accustomed to humiliating. You want to know what I'm talking about? Mitchell pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over a contact labeled simply, HU priority. Andrew stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Mitchell so. But it was too late. The moment for don't had passed years ago, buried under 1,000 small cruelties that had finally accumulated into something too heavy to carry. There's something you should all know, Mitchell said, her voice carrying the weight of 5 years of silence finally breaking. Before the consequences arrive. Before everything you think you know about your lives comes crashing down. She looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces in this last moment before their world changed forever. You called me a burden, she said softly. But you have no idea what burden actually means. You're about to find out. Linda's laugh broke the tense silence, sharp and dismissive. Consequences? What consequences could you possibly? I'm Mitchell Valencia. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, ripples of comprehension spreading slowly across each face. What? Thomas's voice came out uncertain, lacking its usual boom. Mitchell met his eyes steadily. Mitchell Valencia, founder and CEO of Valencia Holdings, the corporation that employs every single person in this room. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Clara's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Linda's wine glass tilted dangerously in her suddenly nerveless fingers. Thomas gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his face draining of color so rapidly Mitchell wondered if he might actually faint. That's not possible, Thomas stammered. Valencia Holdings is owned by the board of directors. We've met the CEO. You've met the CEO I hired to be the public face, Mitchell corrected calmly. I structured the company intentionally to keep myself out of the spotlight. Only a handful of people know my true identity. Andrew was one of them. Every eye turned to Andrew, who had collapsed back into his chair, his face gray, his hands trembling. Andrew! Linda's voice cracked. Is this true? He nodded slowly, unable to meet anyone's gaze. You knew. Thomas's voice rose. You knew your wife owned the company we work for and you never told us? She asked me not to, Andrew whispered. I didn't ask, Mitchell corrected gently. You begged me to hide it. You said you couldn't live in my shadow, that you needed to be your own man. So I made myself smaller for you. I pretended to struggle financially while I ran a multi-billion-dollar empire. I sat at this table and listened to lectures about corporate etiquette from people who work in a company I built. I endured criticisms about my lack of ambition from a family whose entire lifestyle exists because of my ambition. She paused, letting the weight of it settle over them. I wore thrift store clothes while signing off on executive bonuses. I drove a car held together with duct tape while approving the purchase of the company fleet. I smiled politely while Linda questioned my background, never mentioning that I'd built more from nothing than this entire family has built from privilege. Linda made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Why? Clara whispered, finally finding her voice. Why would you hide all that? Mitchell looked at Andrew, her expression softening with something that might have been sadness or might have been pity. Because I loved him. Because I thought love meant sacrifice. Because I believed that making him comfortable was more important than being honest about who I was. Mitchell, please, Andrew started, but she held up a hand. I tolerated your family's cruelty because I hoped that eventually they'd see me as human, as worthy. I let you diminish me because I thought that's what partnership required. I was wrong. She turned to face Thomas directly. You lectured me about work ethic. You criticized my understanding of corporate culture. You treated me like an ignorant child who needed to be educated about business. But every policy you've ever followed, every procedure you've ever implemented, every standard you've ever upheld, I wrote them. Thomas's face had gone from pale to gray. Linda, you questioned my breeding, my background, my worthiness to be part of this family. But the house you're sitting in? Company property, provided as part of Thomas's executive compensation package. A package I personally approved. Linda's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. No one moved to clean it up. Clara, you mocked my clothes, my car, my apparent lack of sophistication. But your position in administrative services? Your salary? Your benefits? All came from a company I built from a foster home bedroom when I was 16 years old. No, Clara breathed. No, this can't be. I didn't want it to end this way, Mitchell said, her voice steady despite the emotion flickering beneath. I wanted to simply deliver the divorce papers and leave quietly, the same way I've done everything else in my relationship with this family, without making waves, without demanding recognition, without insisting on basic respect. She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. But you couldn't even give me that. You had to celebrate. You had to mock me one more time. You had to make sure I understood exactly how worthless you all believed me to be. Mitchell, wait. Thomas started to stand. You deserve the truth before the consequences arrive, Mitchell said quietly. That's more courtesy than you ever showed me. She pressed the call button. It's time, she said to whoever answered. Execute the terminations. All of them. Effective immediately. Thomas's phone erupted first, the shrill ringtone cutting through the stunned silence like an alarm. His hands shook as he fumbled to answer it, his eyes never leaving Mitchell's face. Hello? Yes, this is Thomas Simon. His voice sounded hollow, distant. He listened for a moment, then another, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to raw horror. What do you mean terminated? There must be some mistake. I've been with the company for 23 years. I demand to speak to. The line went dead. Thomas stared at his phone like it had transformed into something alien. What is it? Linda demanded, her voice pitched high with panic she didn't yet fully understand. Thomas, what did they say? Before he could answer, Linda's own phone buzzed. Then Clara's. Then the laptop on the side table chimed with Andrew's work email notification. They all reached for their devices simultaneously, a grotesque synchronized movement that would have been comical if it weren't so devastating. Linda read her screen and let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, something more primal, more broken. Terminated. Effective immediately. Reason, gross misconduct and breach of professional integrity. She looked up at Mitchell with wild eyes. This is a mistake. This has to be a mistake. It's not a mistake, Mitchell said quietly. You've all been reviewed and found to have violated multiple company policies. What policies? Thomas roared, his face flushing red with desperate anger. I've never broken a single rule in my entire career. Nepotism, Mitchell stated calmly. Using your position to secure employment for family members without proper vetting procedures. Andrew was hired based on your recommendation despite not meeting the minimum qualifications for his position. Clara's application bypassed standard HR channels entirely because of your influence. That's standard practice. Thomas sputtered. Everyone does that. Not in my company, Mitchell replied. Additionally, there's the matter of hostile work environment creation, abuse of executive privileges, and misrepresentation of company resources. Clara's face had gone pale, her phone clutched in both hands. My access is revoked. Everything email, building security, benefits portal. It's all gone. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. How can you do this? I have bills, I have rent. You have 72 hours to vacate company housing, Mitchell said, her voice devoid of emotion. That should give you adequate time to make arrangements. The words took a moment to penetrate. When they did, the panic in the room elevated to something approaching hysteria. Company housing? Linda's voice came out as a whisper. But this is our home. We've lived here for 15 years. This residence is provided as part of Thomas's executive compensation package, Mitchell explained with the patient tone of someone reading from a manual. Upon termination of employment, all company-provided assets must be returned. That includes this house, the company car in the garage, and any equipment or materials belonging to Valencia Holdings. Thomas lunged forward, his hands slamming on the table hard enough to rattle the wine glasses. You can't do this. This is our livelihood. Our entire lives. It was your livelihood, Mitchell corrected. Your positions have been terminated legally and in accordance with all employment laws. Severance packages have been calculated based on your years of service and will be direct deposited within the standard time frame. Severance. Thomas laughed, wild and desperate. What good is severance when you've destroyed our reputations? Who's going to hire us after termination for misconduct? Mitchell said nothing. The answer was obvious and they all knew it. Andrew had been silent through the entire exchange, staring at his laptop screen where the termination notice glowed with cold finality. Mitchell, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Please. We can work this out. It's too much. Too much. Mitchell's composure cracked slightly, a flash of genuine emotion breaking through. Too much is 5 years of humiliation. Too much is being called a burden by people I supported. Too much is watching you sit silent while your family tore me apart piece by piece. Too much is celebrating my pain like it's a victory. We didn't know. Linda cried, moving toward Mitchell with outstretched hands. If we'd known who you were, you would have treated me differently, Mitchell finished. Exactly. You would have respected me for my money, not for my humanity. That's precisely why I hid it. And that's exactly why this is the only possible outcome. Clara dropped to her knees, literally begging. Please, Miss Valencia. I'm sorry. We're all sorry. We'll apologize, we'll make it right. You're sorry you got caught, Mitchell said, not unkindly. You're sorry there are consequences. But you're not sorry for how you treated me. If I walked back in here tomorrow as plain Mitchell with no money, no power, no company, you'd treat me exactly the same way you always have. The truth of it hung in the air, undeniable. Thomas tried a different approach, his voice taking on a threatening edge. This is illegal termination. We'll sue. We'll take you to court and expose exactly what you've done. Please do, Mitchell interrupted calmly. I have 5 years of documentation. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every instance of disrespect, recorded, time-stamped, and corroborated by witnesses. I have financial records showing the money I spent supporting Andrew while you all believed he was supporting me. I have performance reviews, HR complaints, and policy violations that would take days to read through in court. She paused, letting the weight of her preparation sink in. I've been building this case for months. Every termination is legally airtight. Every policy violation is documented. You can sue, but you'll lose. And in the process, you'll spend whatever severance you receive on legal fees. The fight drained out of Thomas like air from a punctured tire. He sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. An email notification chimed on Thomas's phone. He opened it with shaking hands, his face going from red to gray as he read. 72 hours to vacate. After that, law enforcement will be called to remove any remaining occupants and possessions. Linda began to sob, ugly, broken sounds that filled the dining room. Clara remained on her knees, her face buried in her hands. Andrew sat frozen, his entire world collapsing in real time. Mitchell stood amid the wreckage of the Simon family with perfect calm. This wasn't victory. It didn't feel triumphant or satisfying. It simply felt necessary. Like lancing a wound that had festered for too long. "You made me feel worthless," she said quietly. "You made me question my own value. You took someone who had built an empire and convinced her she should be grateful for scraps of basic human decency." She looked at each of them one final time. "Now you know what it feels like to lose everything. To have your security ripped away. To realize that the foundation you built your life on was never really yours at all." Mitchell walked toward the door, her footsteps steady and sure. Behind her, the Simon family remained in their dining room, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration that had transformed into a wake. Andrew caught up with her at the door, his hand closing around her wrist, not roughly, but with the desperate grip of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. "Mitchell, wait. Please." She stopped, not turning around, her hand resting on the doorknob. "Let go of me, Andrew. Just give me 1 minute. Please." His voice cracked on the word, and despite everything, despite the years of hurt and the justified anger, Mitchell felt something in her chest twist painfully. She turned to face him. Andrew's eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale except for 2 hectic spots of color on his cheeks. He looked like a man watching his life burn down in real time and finally understanding what he'd lost in the flames. "I remember," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I remember when you stayed up all night with me when I had food poisoning. When you talked me through my panic attack before the big presentation. When you listened to me complain about work for hours, never once mentioning that you were dealing with things 1,000 times more stressful." Mitchell said nothing, her expression carefully neutral. "You paid off my student loans," Andrew continued, his voice breaking. "My credit cards. My car. You did all of that and never asked for anything in return. Never threw it in my face. Never made me feel small for needing help. Until you made yourself feel small," Mitchell said quietly. "I didn't do that to you, Andrew. You did it to yourself." "I know." Tears spilled down his cheeks now, unrestrained. "God, Mitchell, I know. I was so stupid. I was so insecure and petty and blind. You loved me. You genuinely loved me, and I destroyed that because I couldn't handle my own inadequacy." "You're right," Mitchell agreed, and the simple acknowledgement seemed to hit him harder than any accusation could have. "I did love you. Genuinely. Completely. I loved you enough to make myself invisible. To pretend I was less than I was. To tolerate your family's cruelty because I thought that's what love required. I'm sorry." The words came out as a sob. "I'm so sorry. For everything. For asking you to hide. For letting my family treat you like that. For being too much of a coward to defend you. For ending our marriage because I was too insecure to be married to someone extraordinary." Andrew reached for her other hand, holding both of hers in his trembling grip. Please, Mitchell. We can fix this. I'll tell everyone the truth. I'll stand up to my family. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't do this. Don't walk away." Mitchell looked down at their joined hands, remembering all the times she'd held these same hands and felt safe, loved, chosen. All the times she'd convinced herself that his love was worth the price of her dignity. "Andrew," she said gently, pulling her hands free. "What you're sorry for isn't hurting me. You're sorry for losing access to my resources. You're sorry that your comfortable life is disappearing. You're sorry that you don't get to have both, the wife with all the money and power, and the ego boost of feeling superior to her. That's not true. It is true, Mitchell interrupted, her voice still kind but implacable. If I'd revealed who I was and you'd stayed married to me, you would have resented me even more. You would have felt even smaller. The problem was never that I hid my identity. The problem was that you couldn't handle who I actually am. Andrew opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, the truth of her words settling over him like a shroud. You didn't want a wife who outshined you, Mitchell continued. You wanted someone you could feel superior to. Someone who needed you, who relied on you, who made you feel like a man simply by being less successful than you were. Mitchell, now you don't have the company that supported you, she finished quietly. You don't have the career I arranged for you, the salary I approved, the benefits I provided. You don't have the wife who loved you enough to erase herself. You have exactly what you said you wanted. The freedom to find yourself, to be your own man, to succeed on your own terms. The words landed like physical blows. Andrew stumbled back a step, his face crumpling with the weight of understanding what he'd truly lost. I loved you, Mitchell said, and her voice carried the past tense like a funeral bell. I loved you enough to sacrifice everything I was. But you never loved me, Andrew. You loved the idea of me. The small, manageable, non-threatening version I created because you asked me to. That's not fair, Andrew whispered. Neither was asking me to hide who I am, Mitchell replied. Neither was sitting silent while your family mocked me. Neither was divorcing me because your ego couldn't handle being married to someone successful. She reached out and touched his cheek, a gesture so gentle it made him flinch more than anger would have. I hope you find yourself, Andrew. I genuinely do. But you're not going to find yourself in my shadow, and you're not going to find yourself in my company. You're going to have to do it the way I did, by yourself, from nothing, with no safety net and no one to catch you when you fall. Please don't do this, he begged one last time, his voice barely audible. I love you. I swear, I really do love you. Mitchell smiled sadly. Maybe you do. But you love yourself more and you always will. That's not something I can fix, and it's not something I should have to live with. She turned and opened the door, the cool night air rushing in like a cleansing breath. Goodbye, Andrew. He stood in the doorway, watching her walk down the path to her car, the sleek black Tesla that represented everything he'd never been able to accept about her. He watched her climb in, watched her start the engine, watched the life she'd built for them disappear down the street without looking back. And for the first time, Andrew understood the full weight of what he'd destroyed. Not a marriage. Not a relationship. The only person who had ever loved him unconditionally enough to make herself smaller so he could feel bigger. Behind him, in the house that would no longer be theirs in 72 hours, his family's sobs echoed through rooms that suddenly felt hollow. Andrew closed the door and leaned against it, sliding down to sit on the floor. He'd wanted to be his own man. Now he finally was. And he'd never felt more alone. Mitchell drove for 20 minutes before pulling over into a quiet overlook that faced the city lights. Her hands were steady on the wheel, but her heart was racing, adrenaline and relief and grief all mixing together into something she couldn't quite name. She'd done it. She'd finally, definitively chosen herself. The thought should have felt triumphant, but instead it just felt necessary. Like setting down a weight she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Mitchell pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, past all the business numbers and corporate executives, until she found the one she was looking for, Dr. Sarah Chen, the therapist she'd been seeing secretly for the past 6 months. It's done, she texted. I told them. All of them. The response came almost immediately. How do you feel? Mitchell sat with the question, really examining what she felt beneath the adrenaline and the exhaustion. Free, she said. Relieved. Like I've been holding my breath for 5 years and finally remembered how to exhale. That's normal. Come see me this week. We have a lot to process. Mitchell smiled at her phone. Yes, that's what she needed. Time to process what she'd given, what she'd lost, and most importantly, what she'd reclaimed. She thought about the girl she'd been at 16, coding in a foster home bedroom with nothing but determination and a borrowed laptop. That girl had built an empire because she'd believed in herself, because she'd refused to let circumstance define her worth. Somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten that girl. She'd let love, or what she'd thought was love, convince her that being chosen was more important than choosing herself. That belonging to someone else's family was worth disappearing from her own life. But that girl was still there, buried under years of compromise and patience. And tonight, Mitchell had finally let her out. 3 days later, Mitchell sat in her corner office on the 42nd floor of Valencia Holdings headquarters. The city spread out before her like a kingdom she'd forgotten she ruled. Her nameplate had been changed that morning. Mitchell Valencia, founder and so. No more hiding. No more pretending. No more making herself small. Her assistant knocked gently. Ms. Valencia? The movers confirmed that the Oak Ridge Drive property has been vacated. All company assets have been recovered. Mitchell nodded, feeling something twist in her chest. Not quite guilt, not quite satisfaction. Just the weight of finality. And the Simon family? Thomas Simon has applied for unemployment benefits. Linda Simon has moved in with her sister in Ohio. Clara Simon is staying with friends while she job hunts. Andrew Simon. The assistant paused. Andrew Simon has relocated to a studio apartment downtown. He's been applying to entry-level positions. Entry-level. Starting over. Exactly what Mitchell had done at 16, except she'd done it without the safety net of family wealth or corporate experience. Thank you, Mitchell said quietly. That will be all. Alone in her office, Mitchell turned to face the window. Somewhere out there, the Simon family was learning what it meant to rebuild from nothing. Learning what it felt like to have security ripped away, to question your worth, to wonder if you'd ever feel stable again. She didn't feel good about their suffering. But she didn't feel guilty about it either. They had built their lives on a foundation they'd never appreciated, mocked the architect while living in the house she'd constructed, and celebrated when they thought they'd finally freed themselves from her presence. Now they understood the truth. They had never freed themselves from her. She had freed herself from them. 1 month later, Mitchell stood at a podium in front of 500 Valencia Holdings employees at the annual company meeting. For the first time in the company's history, she was speaking publicly as herself, not through a proxy CEO, not hidden behind corporate structure. Just Mitchell Valencia. Founder, builder, survivor. Many of you are meeting me for the first time today, she began, her voice steady and clear. Some of you have worked for this company for years without knowing I existed. That was intentional. I built Valencia Holdings to create opportunities, to solve problems, to make the world a little more efficient and a little more connected. She paused, scanning the faces before her. But I also built it to prove something to myself. That a girl who grew up in foster care, who started with nothing, who had every reason to believe she was worthless, that she could create something that mattered. That she was enough exactly as she was. The room was silent, every person listening. I lost sight of that for a while, Mitchell admitted. I let someone convince me that being powerful meant I was unlovable. That success meant I had to apologize for existing. That building an empire meant I should hide in the shadows of my own creation. She smiled, and it was genuine, the first truly genuine smile she'd felt in years. I'm done hiding. I'm done apologizing. I'm done making myself smaller so others can feel bigger. This is my company. These are my accomplishments. This is my life. The applause started slowly, then built into something thunderous. Mitchell let it wash over her, let herself finally, fully accept what she'd always deserved. Recognition. Respect. Her own damn name on her own damn building. That evening, Mitchell returned to her penthouse, the one she'd bought for herself after the divorce, with floor-to-ceiling windows and original artwork and furniture that cost more than most people's cars. She poured herself a glass of wine and stood at the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. How did the speech go? Perfect, Mitchell typed back. I felt like myself again. Maybe for the first time in years. She thought about Andrew, probably sitting in his studio apartment, wondering how his life had gone so wrong so quickly. She thought about the Simon family, scattered and struggling, finally understanding what they'd taken for granted. She didn't hate them. Hate required energy she no longer wanted to spend on people who had never valued her. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge implied that she'd been trying to hurt them, to punish them, to make them suffer the way they'd made her suffer. But that wasn't it at all. This was about consequences. About boundaries. About the simple, fundamental truth that you cannot mistreat people without eventually facing the results of your actions. This was about a woman who had built an empire, lost herself in someone else's insecurity, and finally remembered that she had never needed to be saved. She had always been the one with the power. She had just forgotten to use it. Mitchell raised her wine glass to her reflection in the window, to the woman she'd been, the woman she'd forced herself to become, and most importantly, the woman she was choosing to be moving forward. From successful, unapologetic, free, to new beginnings, she whispered. And finally, after 5 years of silence, Mitchell Valencia smiled. Not with bitterness, not with regret, but with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman who had reclaimed herself. The end. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.